think we're going to finish the fourth chapter of Over Sea Under Stone by Susan Cooper, but don't hold me to that. Jane has discovered that there is a guidebook written by a local reverend that matches some details of the map that they found earlier. She's home alone with the housekeeper because her brothers and her dad are out on the yacht and her mom is painting. She has decided she is going to talk to the guy that wrote this guidebook and see if he can clear up what the discrepancies between the guidebook and the map are. That was the final thought which decided Jane, normally the shy member of the family. On the way she would spend her afternoon. She turned quickly as the door opened, and Mrs. Polk came rolling in. "Finished, Abby? Enjoy it?" "Lovely, thank you very much." Jane gathered up the guidebook and the precious woolly bundle of her cardigan. "Mrs. Polk," she said tentatively, "do you know the Vicar of Treswick?" "Do you know the Vicar of Chiswick?" Surely, she thought, with all those hymns. "Well, not myself personally, no." Mrs. Polk became very grave and solemn. "Being chapel, I don't have no contact with him, though I see en about, of course. Terrible clever man, they do say that vicar is. Was he thinking of taking a look at the church, my dear?" "Yes," Jane said. "After all, I probably shall," she added defensively to herself. "'Tis a beautiful old place. Long way, though, up the hill at the top of the village. You can just see the tower through the trees going up Fish Street from the quay." "I think I know." "Don't get sunstroke now." Mrs. Polk sailed benevolently out with the dishes, and in a moment Jane heard "Abide with me" echoing with rich, gloomy relish down the hall from the kitchen. She ran upstairs, looked hastily round for a place where she might hide the manuscript case, and finally tucked it among the covers at the foot of her bed, so that it could lie among the edge of the mattress and leave no bump. Then, before her nervousness could get the better of her new idea, she went out, clutching her guidebook, into the sleepy afternoon sun. The church at the top of the hill seemed cut off from the sea. Jane could see nothing from there but trees and hills, and even the little village houses ended some 20 yards down the road. The square grey church with its low tower and the big gate-posts opposite it might have been in any wooded valley 100 miles from the sea. In the churchyard, a wizened old man in shirt-sleeves and braces was cutting the grass with a pair of shears. Jane stopped near him at the other side of the wall. "Excuse me," she said, "but is that the vicarage over there?" The old man, wheezing, straightened himself up and holding one arm round to push himself in the small of the back. "That's right," he said laconically, and then just stood there, staring without expression, watching her all the way across the road and up the drive. Jane heard her feet crunching on the gravel, enormously loud in the silent afternoon. The big square grey house, its windows empty and lifeless, seemed to dare her to disturb it. It was a very scruffy house, she thought, for a vicarage. The gravel of the drive was clotted with weeds, and in the rambling garden hydrangea bushes grew spindly and neglected, with the grass of the lawns as high as hay. She pressed the bell push by the side of the peeling door and heard a bell ring faintly inside the house, echoing a long way off. After a long time, when she had just begun to decide with relief that no one was there to answer the bell, she heard footsteps inside the house. The door opened, creaking resentfully, as if it did not often open at all. The man standing there was tall and dark, untidy in an old sports jacket, but at the same time forbidding, with the thickest black eyebrows that Jane had ever seen, growing almost straight across his brow without a break in the middle. He stared down at her. "Yes." His voice was very deep, without a trace of accent. "Is Mr. Hawes Miller in, please?" The tall man frowned. "Mr. who?" "Mr. Hawes Miller, the vicar." His face cleared a little, though the intent, still black-brown stare did not relax. "Ah, I see. Mr. Hawes Miller. I'm afraid it is no longer vicar here. He died a number of years ago." "Oh," said Jane, and stepped back from the doorstep, not at all sorry at the chance to go away. "Well, in that case, perhaps I may be of some help," said the deep, mournful voice. "My name is Hastings. I have replaced Mr. Hawes Mellor here." "Oh," Jane said again. She was beginning to find the lone Mr. Hastings and his strange neglected house and garden rather unnerving. "Oh, no, I don't want to be a nuisance. It was only something about a book he wrote, a guidebook to the village. A flicker of interest seemed to wake in the vicar's dark face. A guidebook to Truessic? There was some talk that he had written one, but I have never been able to trace a copy. What was it you wanted to ask? I am afraid that if you are looking for the book, I can be of no help. Oh, no, Jane said, not without pride. I've got one. She held her little guidebook up to show him. It was just something inside it about the village, and I wondered if he'd got it wrong. The vicar stared down at the book, opened his mouth to say something, and then seemed to change his mind. He held the door wider open and moved his mouth into an uneasy smile. Well, do come in for a few moments, young lady, and we'll see what we can do. I know a little about Truessic myself after my years here. Thank you very much, Jane said nervously as she stepped inside the door, hitching up the ribbon of her ponytail as she followed him down the passage, and hoping she looked reasonably tidy. Not that she would have been out of place if she had been in rags, she thought, looking around her, that the vicarage was one of the most unloved-looking and shabbiest houses she had ever seen. It was big and rambling, with more sense of space than the grey house, but the paint was peeling, the walls grubby, and the floors all bare, with one or two faded rugs. She began to feel rather sorry for the vicar as he strode stiffly along ahead of her. He led her into a room which was obviously his study, with a big desk strewn with papers, two battered cane chairs with faded cushions, and shelves of books all round the walls. Tall French windows stood wide open to show the stretch of long grass that Jane had glimpsed from the front drive. "Now," he said, sitting behind the desk and clearing a space impatiently in the litter of papers on its top, "sit yourself down and tell me what you were going to ask Mr. Hall's Mellor. You've found a copy of his book, have you?" He stared again at the book in Jane's hands. It seemed to fascinate him. "Yes," Jane said. "Would you like to have a look at it?" She held the book out to him. The vicar took it, slowly closing his fingers round the narrow cover, as if it were something infinitely precious. He did not open it, but put it down on the desk before him and looked at it so hard that he seemed not to be seeing it, but thinking about something else. Then he turned his grave, heavy-browed face toward Jane again. "Are you on holiday here?" My name's Jane Drew. I'm staying with my family in the Grey House." "Are you indeed? That is not a house I am familiar with." Mr. Hastings smiled rather grimly. "That is not a house I am very familiar with," Mr. Hastings smiled rather grimly. "Captain Toms has no time for me, I am afraid, a strange, solitary man." "You've never met him," Jane said. "We've never met him," Jane said. "He's gone abroad." "And this book is yours?" His fingers caressed the cover unconsciously. "Is it interesting?" "Oh, tremendously. I love all the stories about Truessic, when there were smugglers and things." For a moment, Jane wondered doubtfully whether to mention the map after all, but her curiosity overcame any doubts. She stood up and crossed to stand beside him, leafing through the book to the page with the map of South Cornwall. "This is the bit that puzzled me. The shape of the coastline. I wanted to ask if it had ever been different once." Standing beside the vicar, she could not see his face, but his shoulders seemed to stiffen as he looked at the map, and the fingers of his hand lying on the desk curled gently underneath into the palm. "Curious question," he said. "I just wondered. I see there's another line penciled over the coastline of the map here. Is that yours?" "Yes." "From your imagination?" The deep voice was very quiet. "More or less. Well, that is, I saw something like it, where in a book or something," Jane floundered, trying to avoid mentioning their manuscript from the attic without actually telling untruths. "If you know about Truessic, Mr. Hastings, do you know if the coast has always been the same shape?" "I should have thought so. A granite coast takes a very long time to change." He was staring at the penciled line. "You say you saw this outline in a book?" "Oh, a book or another map or something," Jane said vaguely. "In the Grey House?" We don't touch the captain's books," Jane said automatically, forgetting that the guidebook must be one of them. "But you have looked around them, no doubt?" The vicar rose to his feet, towering above her, and reached out a long arm to to take a book from one of the shelves. He handed it to Jane. It was very old and covered with shiny scuffed leather, and the pages were cracked and gave off a smell of musty age when she opened it. It was called Tales of Lyonesse, and a lot of the S's were printed like F's. "Have you ever seen any book there like that?" His voice was persistent. He stood between Jane and the light, and looking up at him she could see nothing but a faint glint of light reflected from his eyes in the shadowed face. The effect was for a moment exceedingly sinister, and Jane felt creeping over her the small, cold uneasiness that was becoming familiar about the holiday, a sense of something mysterious that everyone else knew about, but was hidden from her brothers and her. "No, I don't think so." "Are you sure? A title like that, perhaps? You might have seen a map in such a book." No, really, we just haven't looked." "But might you not have seen a volume on a shelf similar to this?" "I honestly don't know," Jane said, shrinking back in her chair at the urgency that had come into his voice. "Why don't you ask the captain?" Mr. Hastings took the book back from her and tucked it back in its place on the shelf. The grave near frown was back on his face. "He is not a communicative man," he said shortly. Uneasiness was nudging more insistently at Jane's mind, and she began to fidget from one foot to another. "Well, I must be off," she said, using one of Mother's phrases brightly and hoping it sounded polite. "I'm sorry to have interrupted you." She glanced rather wildly from the window to the door. The vicar, standing silent and intent, pulled himself together and moved toward the French windows. "You can come out this way. It's quicker. The front door is seldom used." He held out his hand to Jane. "I am pleased to have met you, Miss Drew. I am sorry not to have been more helpful, but I must say I think it is unlikely that our coast here has ever had any characteristics that are not shown in Mr. Hall's map. He was, I understand, a cartographer of some repute. I am glad you came to see me." He inclined his head gravely as he shook Jane's hand with a strange, archaic gesture that reminded her suddenly of Mr. Withers when he had left the grey house. But this, she thought, seemed more genuine, as if it were something Mr. Withers had been trying to imitate. "Goodbye," she said quickly, and ran off through the long feathery grass toward the drive of the silent, shabby house and the road that led back home. And that's the end of Chapter 4.